Hello and welcome to the Deep Dive Perspective. Bondi Beach, yet another psychological operation, a false flag, or a real act of terror? We can never tell, really. I mean, the reality is that things happen and we get told by a media, which is often controlled by the same old suspects. You know, Zionist media across the Western media circuit is a known thing now. So why would you trust them? But the reality is that within almost minutes or hours of this incident happening, all we got was an absolute tirade of Hasbara and Israeli, probably Mossad-led propaganda, basically accusing all sorts of people of doing something which even they don't have actually any confirmation of. Yet this is the way media is rolled out now, this, as a tool potentially for pushing certain narratives. With me in the studio, I have Ehsan Safar-nejad. Welcome to the show, Ehsan.
Thanks for inviting me.
I don't really make a habit of reacting to the news too much within the DZP setup. And of course, there are, very scarce facts on the ground at the moment. So it's one which I'm going to deal with really with you from a bigger perspective, because one thing's for sure, these kinds of incidents have huge impact on ordinary people's lives, whether it was 9/11, whether it was 7/7 here in Britain, whether it was the Charlie Kirk incident. Fact is, they roll and roll. These things can be utilized for decades to create certain narratives, to push certain political agendas. What's your take on this one so far, in terms of what you have information-wise about what's gone on so far? And then we'll open up the discussion to the broader question of psychological operations and false flags.
Well, the first thing that I think we should mention is the crackdown by the Australian regime on, the Iranian armed forces, more specifically the IRGC, which is a branch of the Iranian armed forces. A while ago, Australian regime decided to designate IRGC as a terror organization and basically cut ties with the Iranian government, which I think, in my opinion, it's rather a positive development. We don't really need to basically have ties with governments that sell parts, weapon systems parts, to the genocidal regime of Israel. But anyway, this is the environment in which this incident happened, this terror attack, whatever the nature of it might be, took place. And from the very first moment, without knowing too much, knowing anything basically, the Israeli war criminals started doing what they do best, which was playing the victim card and accusing other actors in the region for instability and what they actually instigated. And they started immediately mentioning the names of Iran and Hezbollah, without any proof. Obviously, now even the Australian media is saying that the father and son, Sajid and Naveed Akram, one of them traveled they both traveled to Philippines, one of them on an Indian passport, the other one on an Australian passport, which, assume based on their narrative, they're Indians, they have no ties with Iran, and based on the school that they were attending, at least the son, it's a Salafi movement, which anyone who knows anything about the religion, and I hate to do this, but this is the way that the mainstream media seeks to basically portray things. It tries to fearmonger based on ethnicity, religion, and so on and so forth in order to justify the never-ending wars and things of that nature. But basically, they're Salafi movements, and now they are. Even the Australian media is talking about how these people basically were working on the basis of ISIS ideology, which is funny because a US president just took off the deputy of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, and basically framed his past as a rough one. So it is the West that is basically propagating these ideologies and supporting and funding these radical groups. And when something like this happens, it is the reputation of the Muslims that is being tarnished. One final point that I really like to make on this point is that I do believe that the fact that something like this gets more media coverage than 100,000 Palestinians being massacred, many people being amputated, losing their loved ones, displaced, children being amputated, having their face, basically disfigured, and so on and so forth. It really tells you something. You can't really compare tragedies with one another. It's not a mathematical problem, but it really tells you something when the number is extremely high on one side, but the mainstream media isn't so quick as to frame an entire population a certain way. And, they always try to give them the benefit of the doubt when it comes to the crimes of the Israeli regime. But at instances like this, without any proof, they're very quick to blame certain actors and mention certain countries.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. Well, social media, of course, does try to get to the truth. Still, there are people out there who seem to be very, very cynical about this incident, and I'm one of them. Reality is that time and time again, we see in retrospect who are the winners and who are the losers from such incidents. And already I can sense that, for instance, the Jewish Zionist lobbies here in the West are already ramping up the incident as a means of getting even more security apparatus working on their side, even more laws to clamp down on what they call anti-Semitism, which is actually just a suffix for basically supporting Israel and supporting genocide. And I'm glad you raised the issue of genocide, because no doubt, as with this case with Charlie Kirk, we're going to get chapter and verse, and we're going to have details of individuals, and there's going to be a sympathy for those who are dead. And I'm almost tempted to say I don't really care about Bondi Beach and what's happened there, because not one of the major incidents of bombing, as you pointed out, in Israel, of Gazans, just that for an example, actually got nothing like this attention in the media. So clearly there is an agenda here at work when Zionist media jumps on an incident like this, and it all seems to be very prepared, where Mossad and Israel are getting involved in a country's affairs, Australia, which ostensibly has nothing to do with Israel on the surface, and yet there they are involved in the investigation, and already Mossad and others are involved. How does that work? It's a bit like maybe an African set of people being killed in Australia, and then suddenly the whole of Africa wants to be involved in investigating this incident and putting it across as a racist incident. I mean, it's extraordinary that Israel gets to do this kind of thing.
Well, you know what they say. The Israeli regime and the ideology of Zionism runs on basically anti-Semitism, and this is what they manufacture themselves. They want you to do that, to basically feel this way, right? They're playing a very complex, in a way, game, because they play. I mean, it's obvious, but somehow certain people are not capable of seeing it. At one side, they're the victims, and at the same time, they want to portray this image of being powerful and doing everything with impunity. So this actually, it's a very corrupt and twisted game that they are playing. But this reminded me, when I heard the name of Iran being mentioned, it reminded me of the instances in which Iran actually helped United States thwart certain attacks, against the U.S. regime. Basically because of the fact that Iran knew that these attacks were going to be used as a false flag, and then, the ramifications of that would be clear. But the Australian regime, despite everything that it has decided to do, and I'm referring to the recent developments with Iran, which I just mentioned, it's still being blamed by the Israeli regime for not doing enough. And that's the mentality of the Zionists. No matter how much you give them, you give them an inch and they want to take a yard. So this is not something that is going to end. I hope, I know that it's a futile naivety that to expect the Australian politicians to wake up from this slumber that they have, but no matter what they do, they will be unable to appease the Israeli regime. And this will continue. The thing is that with the Zionists, you don't really need proof. They don't really need proof for what they claim, for what they assert. And on the other side, no matter how many weird things, quirks, different things that don't really add up, you start to mention, it's never enough. Like the fact that Navid Akram's name was apparently Googled in Israel. Rather strange, but it's anti-Semitic of someone to actually want to have answers for things like this, right? Or someone who mentions that, well, one of the Zionist leaders in this shooting, took a selfie apparently in the middle of something, and so you don't have any right to question. Okay, this sounds a little bit strange because I think that my first instinct wouldn't be to take a selfie in the middle of a terror attack. So these things don't mean anything. You just have to believe the Zionist agenda. And you know what they say about the new definition of Zionism. Anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is when you say something that is not against the Jews, but a kind of speech that the Zionists don't like. And unfortunately, this is the situation that we have to deal with for now, at least.
Well, everybody is censored from speaking the truth about such affairs in the West now, to some degree or another, on every platform. But I noticed not less than a couple of weeks ago, a very prominent ex-Guardian journalist, Melanie Phillips, was basically spewing hate speech, playing the victim card, at the same time asserting, as you rightly said, the dominance of Israel, but almost making it obligatory on people to regard anything that's said against Israel as being anti-Semitic. And there is the IHRA ruling here, which they're still pushing to become legalized as law officially, but it's already being adopted by companies, it's being adopted by the NHS now, I gather, it's being adopted by professional bodies, which are, of course, then sanctioning doctors, and they're sanctioning free speech across the board. So already that tool is being used. An incident like this, of course, becomes more meat and drink for them. It becomes like a means of accelerating those draconian laws against the public here. And of course, the Muslims are, as you said, front line. What do you see the impact being of consistent false flags like this, or alleged false flags from my perspective, which lead to more and more racism on the ground? 10 years ago, you wouldn't have seen the right wing or the far right garnering such support, popular support, in the Reform Party here in Britain, also with Tel Aviv Tommy Robinson and his fraternity out doing million-man marches. There's a real mood in Europe which has been created, it seems, by this Zionist element. And then the bizarre factor is also that these far-right people who want Muslims out, who want to use incidents like this to castigate foreigners and migrants, they're actually pally-pally with the Zionists. They're actually friends. Tel Aviv Tommy Robinson is promoting friendship with the one group, which is a foreigner group as well, which is a foreign interest, which is openly working its foreign interests within British establishment politics. And yet there's this very interesting dissection, which makes me think that, again, Zionists perhaps are behind even the far-right movements that exist here in Europe and the West. What are your thoughts?
Well, I like to first comment on one thing that you mentioned, the Muslim community. if I was an official in Australia, I would try to highlight the fact that the person who thwarted this attack was a Muslim, Ahmed al-Ahmed. But I mean, the way that I saw Anthony, I'm referring to the Prime Minister of Australia. Right now, I'm blanking on his name. But the way that he described him was as an Australian hero. You know, I mean, common sense, at least to me, says that in a situation like this, you have to have damage control. You have to basically set the tone in such way that different communities don't want to take revenge, create a sense of unity and cohesive sense of empathy towards what has happened and condemnation against the attack itself. But I don't really see them portraying and highlighting the fact that this man was a Muslim. You see them if you read the entire article, but it's rarely in the title itself, which, I mean, as you know, most people just basically gloss over the titles, headlines, rather than reading the entire article. So I think that that's one thing that people should really
hold your thought on that, son, because the little addition I've got to that is that Netanyahu said it called him a Jew. His official response publicly, very quickly, they got on and almost captured that narrative before it got hold. It's impossible that he wouldn't have known that that person wasn't a Jew. He would have had the information on the ground, but he slipped it in one of his speeches to create even more confusion as to the fact that the one who fought these apparent terrorists was a Muslim himself. But that's not convenient for the newspaper's headlines, so he kind of put it out there that it was a Jew, falsely.
Yeah, and I think that this is the perfect segue in order for us to transition into the second part of your question about the fact that the change in the movement and the things that are happening, whether in Europe or other parts of the world. The fact is that an incident on its own doesn't mean anything if the journalists don't report on it. So, and that's what really terrifies me, because, again, as I mentioned, the lives of 100,000 Palestinians don't really mean anything to these supposed journalists. Very weird. But anyway, but this is the thing. The narrative that is shaped around a certain incident or an attack, terror attack, whatever, it's really important. And it basically gives birth or shifts the already established political movements in different countries. And I think that, you mentioned the name of Tommy Robinson. These people have no problem, disseminating misinformation, disinformation. And, you also mentioned social media. One thing about social media is that people are very quick to correct you in your comment section. But these people see the facts and they don't really care. So it's a situation in which you see Hasbara being in full force. And obviously, considering what happened during the past 2 years, they need a rebranding. So now they are basically, cracking down on free speech or anyone who has an alternative narrative to the one that they are trying to push. They're trying to crack down on them. And, I can't really see any awakening inside the people. I know that people are happy about the marches and the protests, the solidarity movements, but at the same time, I see, for example, Palestine. What was the name of the proscribed
Palestine Action
in UK? I'm blanking on the
Palestine Action.
Palestine. But at the same time, I see more draconian laws being passed. So it seems that at least the one thing that we can say without any doubt is the fact that there is a gap between the people and the lawmakers and the political officials, and they're just going to go in that direction. And as you mentioned, And as I mentioned as well during my response to your previous question, this is only going to be used as the fuel for justifying more draconian laws. And the fact that people don't really pay attention to this will only make things worse, because I'm still waiting for the time that people say enough is enough. These laws are getting ridiculous, but I'm not really seeing that.
Well, you're absolutely right. Your hunch is spot on. We've had programs dealing with the psychological operations within the left movement, which is supposedly supporting Palestine itself. So even these movements, which are supposedly anti-war, fighting against Israeli Hasbara or fighting for Palestinian rights, it seems as though there's a lot of evidence building up within the people who really ask questions here as to what their real agenda is. And it does seem increasingly as though what we've got is Zionists, out and out Zionists on the far right, who are doing what they do and ideologically are committed to that whole idea and unashamed about it. And then you, like your Tommy Robinsons and your Nigel Farages and others. Then you've got the left, which kind of pretends to be with Palestine and pretends to have justice and be anti-imperialist, yet they too also just seem to be increasingly what I would describe as controlled opposition. There to manage the fallout, to control the people who are outraged and to funnel them into a direction which is acceptable to the Zionists as well. So we may be being kettled here, even within the mainstream institutions. There's increasing evidence to suggest that's the case. And all of this, of course, ultimately is being supported by the Western media. And who are the Western media? Well, Mr. Bezos runs Washington Post, owns Washington Post, an avowed Zionist. Elon Musk runs X and other things, an avowed Zionist as far as I can see. There's also here Rupert Murdoch across the globe, Australian in origin, funnily enough. And again, the Times and all of the other rags that exist here, many of them under his control, Sky News. So, you see what I'm saying. If I went on and on, the Barclay brothers, again, you have a litany of media in the West, ultimately controlled by Zionists or those who have the Israel in their hearts. Robert Maxwell was one, and we know what that led to with Epstein and all the networks they have and the connections with Israel and Mossad. So it is very worrying. And what I would say, and I'll conclude it here really, because Ehsan has given us I think a really good perspective. But we need to ask critical questions. We need to think seriously. We need to think, in a sort of a lateral manner, in a deeper manner. Because when we see incidents like this, we think this across the other side of the world, what does it have to do with us? In reality, they shape your mind. In reality, they're going to shape your legal realities in the Western nations, and they're going to motivate certain actions by the government, by the security services, which will not only attack the minorities in this country, but they will also then, once they've gone for them, they'll come for you. And that's exactly what I'll mention here, because the Terror Act in 2000 originally was regarded by everybody as just something that targeted Muslims and Islamic terrorists, Islamist terrorists. Well, 20 years on, have a little look at how those terrorist charges or those laws are operating. They're actually arresting 90-year-old women of Anglo-Saxon origin here in England and across in America. You can see the effects. So what they do in Palestine and what they do in false flag incidents and what they do with Muslim communities today, for instance, is coming to you very soon. And in fact, I would say it's here already. We need to challenge it. We need not to comply with everything that they roll out. And we need to stand up and actually fight for those freedoms that you try to enforce on other countries, Iran being one victim of this, where, freedom, life, and goodness knows what else is pushed on them. But here, we're not even getting our freedom of speech. Food for thought. Thank you, Ehsan. Thank you for your reactions to this incident and giving us a broader view. Until the next deep dive perspective, do please hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons. Goodbye.